So at first, this was just going to be a quick video about the archaeology of Greenland to hop on a trendy topic. I was just going to go over some scattered Norse ruins and some ice mummies I first saw as a kid. But I was in for quite a surprise because Greenland's archaeology is way more fascinating than you'd think. Best exemplified by how long it's taken to make this video. For such a desolate, sparsely populated, ironically named place, Greenland has an incredibly rich history filled with all kinds of archaeological treasures. And what's more, I think it genuinely offers an insight into who should own this incredible island. But we'll get to that near the end. The first humans to live in Greenland arrived there some 4,500 years ago, right after the pyramids of Giza had been built and as the Bellbeaker folk were arriving in Britain. Those first humans were known as the early Paleo-Eskimo. I know that name is a bit outdated, but that's what they're still called. They were descendants of the Denby culture of Alaska, and they're totally unique among the indigenous peoples of the Americas because they arrived in North America from across the Bering Strait some 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, well after the first Native Americans. So in a way, you could say that they discovered America 5,500 years before Columbus. And incredibly, these were the first humans to populate the North American Arctic. There were two cultures of early Paleo-Eskimos in Greenland, the Independence One culture in the north and the Saqqaq culture in the south. The Independence One culture has such an odd name because the first sites of theirs to be scientifically analyzed lie along a fjord named Independence Fjord, which is in far northern Greenland. Based on the dates of some muskox bones they butchered, they probably arrived in Greenland around 2460 to 2400 BC. In addition to northern Greenland, it was also present in the islands of the Canadian High Arctic, where it's the earliest settlement phase there too. But regardless, ruins from this initial wave of human migration into Greenland can still be found at the excellently named Memnon sites and another site called Solbakken. And they did leave actual stone ruins behind. It's just that they're a bit low-key since they're in the form of so-called mid-passage tent rings with space available for maybe 4 to 6 people per tent, so probably whole families. They're usually found clustered in groups of 5 or more, which would represent like 20, 30 people. But it varied. The best picture of these guys comes from Peryland, or the Peryland Peninsula, where most of their sites are. In spring and summer, they hunted along the coast at the mouths of fjords like Jorgenbronland Fjord and Wandeldal Fjord, where they left behind small, single-family summer camps. During fall and the harsh, dark winter, they would group up in larger, possibly more permanently settled sites along inland lakes. That includes the sites of Port Fjeldet and Perleandville, the richest known Independence One site. Regardless, they generally seem pretty egalitarian, and there aren't many signs of social rank or any non-residential buildings to suggest otherwise. The people of Independence One relied on muskox, and probably also ate the occasional sea mammal, fish, and migratory bird. At those big lake sites, they stored all their muskox meat in meat caches, a recurring feature of Arctic sites, and those type of sites are probably where they did most of their flint napping, since despite making it to the top of the world, they still completely relied on rather small stone tools. And since they didn't even work soapstone at this point, they also didn't have the soapstone oil lamps that their successors relied on for light and warmth. A man named Eigil Knuth spent his life uncovering the remains of Peryland's many archaeological sites from 1938 all the way to 1995. He was also apparently in the Danish resistance during World War II. But the area he spent his normal career in was so remote that he and his companions were the first modern people to penetrate the interior of Johannes V. Jensen Land, the northernmost bit of Peryland. But they obviously weren't the first people there, period, because there, along Frigg Fjord, they discovered a large semi-permanent campsite, which they named the Adam C. Knuth site, after the archaeologist's younger brother. That site represents the first attempt to colonize what's essentially the northernmost part of the world, probably in the footsteps or I guess hoof prints of a likely diminishing muskox population. As we're going to see time and time again though, the people of the Independence One culture had to abandon their homes for good and disappeared, possibly due to a cooling climate, and probably around 1800 BC. Their successors in the region, the creatively named Independence Two culture, which is probably identified identifiable as part of the much larger Dorset culture, was able to endure in Peryland from around 900 or 800 BC to 400 BC. Their biggest site by far is an aggregation seal hunting camp called Cap Saint-Jacques on the deceptively French-sounding Île-de-France, further to the south, which contains a whopping 500 ruined structures. Notably, the people of Independence 2 also liked making tools out of quartz crystal, which looked pretty cool. But again, they also had to abandon the region, and in fact, Greenland and the high Arctic as a whole lay abandoned between 1 and 700 AD. The Independence 1 culture's contemporaries and cousins in southern and western Greenland were the people of the Saqqaq Culture, which endured for some 1700 years between 2500 BC and 800 BC. In addition to Greenland's southern and western coasts, it also occupied its east coast up to Scoresby Sund, which comes up a lot in Greenland's history as a sort of natural boundary. The Saqqaq culture was mainly concentrated around the Nuuk area, where the sites of Itinera and Nunguak are, along with the Sisimiut district and along the southern shores of Disco Bay, where they procured a type of slate alternative for flint known as kiliak, which was extracted in huge quantities. Interestingly, they are known to have made nails out of ivory at the Nipisat site, where they also left 65,000 animal bones dug up between 1989 and 1994. Its remains have also been found on Ellesmere Island in Canada, and it was actually first identified here in 1954 by Jorgen Meldgaard after his excavations at Igloolik in the Fox Basin of Nunavut. I know these names are a bit tough, and I'm sorry for butchering them all. The name of the Saqqaq culture is still Greenlandic, though, because Meldgaard named it after excavations near the Greenlandic hamlet of Saqqaq, conducted in 1948 by a different guy, Hans Mosgaard. People of the Saqqaq culture were more numerous than the people of Independence 1, but they similarly lived in mid-passage tent rings, originally covered in skins. Their largest winter dwellings were just 6 meters long and 3 to 4 meters wide, where at max 2 families could live. And like the people of Independence 1, they also lacked large non-residential dwellings. Still, individual sites in especially resource-rich areas could contain dozens of dwellings each, and were probably left behind after large gatherings held during the peaks of hunting seasons. Unlike Independence 1, the Saqqaq might have been more focused on hunting caribou instead of muskox. Regardless, after a gradual transition and the introduction of soapstone lamps, they eventually developed into the Dorset Culture, which would occupy Greenland on and off for the ensuing millennia. The insanely artistic Dorset culture first emerged in the eastern Arctic between 800 and 500 BC, but that doesn't actually mean that the Paleo-Eskimos were replaced. A 2014 study of 26 genome-wide DNA sequences and 169 mitochondrial DNA sequences pulled from ancient teeth, hair, and bone revealed that the Paleo-Eskimo people and the Dorset culture people were part of the same distinct population. But the Dorset culture was first identified as a unique culture back in 1925 by a guy named Diamond Jeunesse, and it has such a strange British name because he identified them using artifacts found near modern Kingate in Nunavut, which was known as Cape Dorset at the time, because, you know, Canada, we love our imperial names. It's also chronologically separated into 3 main periods: the early Dorset period lasting from 800 BC to 1 BC, or maybe 700 BC to 200 AD in Greenland's case, the middle Dorset period from 1 to 500 AD, and finally the late Dorset period spanning from between 500 and 1300, or maybe 1400, or maybe 1500. That's around when the Dorset, and with them the Paleo-Eskimo population as a whole, mysteriously vanished. But before that, the range of the Dorset both expanded and shrank. During the Middle Dorset period, they had to abandon Greenland for some 5 centuries or more, but in the meantime, they colonized Newfoundland. Conversely, they abandoned Newfoundland for good after 500 AD during the late Dorset period, when they returned to the very far north of Greenland, albeit briefly. This might have been the result of the climate warming as part of the medieval warm period, which started in North America around 6 to 700 AD, and they appeared back in Smith Sound, known as the gateway to Greenland, by the 8th century. The warming climate might have had some adverse effects too, because the distribution of sea mammals, their bread and butter, was probably altered erratically by changing sea ice conditions. The very existence of their ice corridor hunting grounds would have also been threatened, and having the seaways clear of ice may have allowed a new group of people from Alaska with superior boats to come on in. but we'll get to that later. The types of ruins the Dorset left behind tend to be a bit more substantial than those of their predecessors. They lived in 4x5 meter rectangular stone houses with sunken floors and skin roofs in the winter and skin tents in the summer. They may have even made igloos out of snow and sod. In fact, it's possible that the modern Inuit derived their snow knives from the Dorset, and in general, they were just more sedentary than their pre-Dorset ancestors. As part of this, the Dorset also created massive longhouses up to 45 meters long, which were once thought to be either inspired by the Norse or just Norse, but it's now known that they predate their arrival. These longhouses are so large that it's possible they were never actually roofed, but who knows. The longest of them in Greenland is at a place called Reindeer Point at the mouth of Folk Fjord along the coast of Inglefield Land in northwest Greenland. It's 42 meters long, and like other Dorset longhouses, it's surrounded by open-air hearths for some reason. I couldn't get a good picture of it because the antiquity article it was published in is too old, but whatever, here's where it's supposed to be on Google Maps. So if anyone wants to get pictures of it for me, just feel free to make a quick Arctic trek up there. Unlike the pre-Dorset Paleo-Eskimos, the Dorset abandoned bows and arrows for unknown reasons, and with it they also lost the ability to drill holes, because that's what they used as drills. So all the holes they made had to be painstakingly gouged out. The isolated 19th century polar Inuit also lost the ability to make bows, kayaks, and even fish spears, which they explained was the result of an epidemic that just wiped out everyone with the know-how to make such technology. So maybe something similar happened to the early Dorset. What's more, they still use stone flakes as tools, which they would attach to nice ivory, bone, wooden, or antler handles. They also liked jade and different types of quartz crystals, and we know they even valued rose quartz just in its pure old crystal form because such crystals have been found at their sites. But they had another, stronger material at their disposal too. Cold-hammered meteoric iron from far northwestern Greenland. Sometime in the late Dorset period, they stumbled across a massive 58-ton meteorite, or at least its fragments, which are now known as the Cape York meteorite, and that was probably released from Greenland's ice cap at some indeterminate point before that. Meteoric iron is harder and more difficult to work than normal iron, but small flakes of it could be chipped off using rock hammers, at which point they'd be flattened and shaped with cold hammering before finally being ground against sandstone to create a durable edge. Local Inuit were still using it to make tools into the 19th century, and now the largest part of it, known as Ahnigido, is the largest meteor you can see in a museum. I remember that when I saw it in person, it drew me to it and gave me the irresistible urge to touch and feel it for myself. Which the museum allows, by the way. The Dorset also had access to cold-hammered copper from Canada, too. But the allure of that alien iron may have been what compelled the Dorset, and later the Inuit, to come to Greenland. And regardless, the Dorset traded it all over their domain. The adoption of that meteoric iron might also explain why the Dorset became increasingly artistic and culturally uniform in the late Dorset period. And boy, did they make some interesting art. That includes the earliest human portraits from the Arctic in the form of these ghostly, tattoo-covered and often horned masks. These horns also appear on the little figurines they made, like this piece, known as the Wolf Woman of Baffin Island. Other figures show humans with little slots in their torsos, which might have been ritually killed as sorts of voodoo dolls. In addition to splicing humans and animals together, like that wolf woman, they also liked hybridizing different animals together, like with this falcon with the head of a polar bear. This might have been done so the users of such art could embody the animal's different powers. In that same line of thought, they made ivory animal teeth which could fit inside a person's mouth and which still displayed tooth marks. So maybe they were using them to LARP as bears or something. And just to show off how good they were at carving stuff, they even made perfectly accurate little replicas of skulls and representations of skeletons on the surfaces of figurines depicting things like bears and seals. They also liked carving eerie little grimacing human faces a lot. They even carved them into stone at a place called Kajartalik in Nunavut on an island just north of Quebec. but they're most apparent on a type of wand or baton made of reindeer antlers, which bear dozens of frozen human faces and frequently show up at late Dorset settlements. They're also often visibly worn from being held. It isn't known if they're meant to represent spirits or real people, but regardless, they're still really striking. It's the sort of background aesthetic you'd see in, like, I don't know, a 90s anime or something. But regardless, it looks really cool. But as their artistic repertoire was exploding, their days were numbered. We'll look into their mysterious disappearance when we look into the people who replaced them, the Thule Inuit, who eclipsed them, so to speak. But just before that happened, another distinct group arrived in Greenland, the Norse. The Norse first encountered Greenland at some point in the early 10th century when a guy named Gunnbjorn Ulf Kraukson spotted land west of Iceland after being blown off course on a voyage there from Norway. Later, in 982, a man known as Eric the Red was banished from Iceland for 3 years for manslaughter. So in the meantime, he decided to try and find what Gunnbjorn had seen, and lo and behold, he did. This is the guy responsible for naming Greenland Greenland, by the way, because when he returned to Iceland, he tried to sell the idea of settling it to his fellow Icelanders. So let's just say he needed a marketable name for it. And apparently it worked, since he got 25 ships to head back out to Greenland with him around 985 or 986. But as a taste of how harsh their new home was going to be, only 14 of the ships actually made it. And in a tie back to everything we've just been talking about before this, the 11th century Icelandic medieval chronicler Ari Thorgilsson also states that Eric the Red's men found the abandoned remains of old dwelling places, boats and worked stone objects just left behind by the land's previous inhabitants. So Eric the Red and his posse knew well that others had preceded them there. Eric the Red set himself up at a place called Brattahlid in what's now known as Eriksfjord, which was part of something called the Eastern Settlement, or at the far southern tip of Greenland. But despite its name, it wasn't just one town or anything. No, it covered a whopping 500 kilometers and contained 400 known Norse farms. In addition to the Eastern Settlement, there was also a Western Settlement, known as which was some 240 miles north of the Eastern Settlement, around the modern capital of Greenland, Nuuk, and it contained some 80 or 90 farms. The main reason why the Norse settled Greenland in the first place was to hunt its walruses, which was thought to be a weird type of fish, and whose ivory tusks fetched a pretty penny back in Europe. Since the Vikings quickly wiped out Iceland's walruses, Greenland remained the only source for them. A bit north of the Western Settlement was the Norsemen's main walrus hunting preserve, Disco Bay, which was characterized as a limitless hunting preserve called Nordsetur in the sagas. It's also where much of the contact between the Norse and the late Dorset and early Thule Inuit probably came about. The farthest the Norse ever settled along Greenland's western coast was 67 degrees north, and the northernmost runic inscription they left behind was by one of 3 collapsed cairns on the top of the peak of the island of Kingitorsuaq, which was found back in 1823. It reads this. Other Norse finds have been found as far as Ellesmere Island in Canada, which I covered in part 2 of the Out of Place Artifacts series, but both the eastern and western settlements contain a plethora of amazing archaeological sites. So let's go through the most interesting of them. What was once the Eastern Settlement contains a bunch of different cool sites, and certainly the most imposing surviving Norse ruins in Greenland. For instance, Eric the Red's stomping grounds at Brattahlid, now known as Kasiarsuk, which is where the largest farms of the Eastern Settlement once were, may also contain the remains of what's likely to be the very first church built in the New World, if you count Greenland as part of North America, which it is, geologically speaking. The construction of a school in 1961 revealed several human skulls, which prompted a series of excavations that led to the discovery of a graveyard containing some inscribed gravestones and 100 bodies surrounding a small church built of turf. 9 of these skeletons were carbon dated to between the years 1000 and 1200, and the church they surrounded is thought to have been built by Eric the Red's Christian wife, Theodhild. She built it despite him still being a pagan, which Eric the Red's saga explains was the reason why she stopped sleeping with him, to his displeasure. Culture, as it says. Thiodhild had been converted by her own son, a little-known explorer named Leif Erikson, who'd been sent to Greenland on behalf of Norwegian King Olaf Tryggvason with a priest to introduce Christianity there, though not before accidentally being blown to a mysterious land full of maples and vines. I wonder where that could be. But despite its wholesome beginnings, we know the churchyard witnessed some pretty grisly events throughout its time because it also contained a mass grave. It contained the disarticulated remains of 13 men and a poor 9-year-old child. Otherwise, their heads were neatly arranged in a row on the western end of the grave. 3 of them bore head wounds caused by axes or swords, so it wasn't all peace and love in medieval Greenland. It's possible they were pagans salvaged from a pagan burial ground, or shipwreck victims, or victims of a hunt gone wrong in the far north, or battlefield casualties, maybe from some bloody interclan feud. Who knows? The recovery of bodies from shipwrecks and hunting expeditions gone wrong were actually historically attested events in Norse Greenland, but that doesn't necessarily explain those head wounds. But moving on, another Norse site in southern Greenland is Gardar, also known as Sisarlutok, which sits next to the modern town of Igaliku. It's important because it was the seat of Greenland's own bishop. The first bishop of Greenland was installed in 1126 or 1124, but they only started physically arriving there 90 years later in 1210. Or 1212. The main church there, which in its current form dates to the 13th century, is 32 by 16 meters and was found to contain some pretty choice finds when excavated. In addition to stained glass fragments and a heavy bronze bell, it also contained gold, like this nice golden ring, which was found on the skeletal hand of an unidentified bishop, possibly Bishop Helgi, the first to actually arrive in Greenland, buried uncoffined in the northern chapel of the church and discovered in 1926. He was also buried with this extraordinary walrus ivory crow's ear. Another golden ring was found in the choir, but not on any skeletonized hands. Other than these, small valuables are almost completely absent from Greenland's Norse archaeological sites, which you should keep in mind for later. Nearby are the foundations of a bell tower in a huge 143 square meter hall used for special occasions. There's also an enormous, megalithic-looking barn nearby, which was meant to safeguard livestock during the grim winters. It has room for over 100 of the bishop's cows. Gardar also had another cool feature, irrigation canals, which conducted glacial lake water down to fields which were used in summers to grow the fodder needed to feed those cows. The Church of Gardar is one of just 17 church ruins in the eastern settlement, which also includes Hvalsey near Kakortok, the site of a 1408 wedding which happened to be the very last recorded event in Norse Greenland. Another large church ruin can be found at Herjolfsnes at the very south of the eastern settlement, which acted as Greenland's main harbor to the outside world. But it's more notable for the pristinely preserved artifacts discovered among the occupants of its cemetery. All the bodies there were given wooden crosses, some of which are very ornate, and a total of 58 were found. Also, stone gravestones inscribed in Latin were found there, which is pretty interesting. In place of certain bodies that had gone down with the ships that sunk off Greenland's coasts, there were also replacement rune sticks in empty coffins. For example, this one, which belonged to a woman named Gudveig, reads, "This woman, who was called Gudveig, was laid overboard in the Greenland Sea." And despite how remote it is, Herjolfsnes is amazingly one of the most important sources of surviving medieval European fashion. Despite the bodies themselves being badly preserved, their clothes remained remarkably intact, providing an incredibly rare insight into exactly how medieval commoners dressed, since remarkably, the people of Herjolfsnes still followed European fashion trends even up to when Norse Greenland stops appearing in the historical record. Like, look at this thing, and its equivalents in medieval European paintings. They even followed Northern European burial customs and trends, down to the positions of their hands on their bodies. These remarkable finds are now in Denmark's National Museum, since the Danish National Museum excavated the site under Poul Norlund in the year 1921. But the most intimate glimpse we have into Norse Greenland comes from the intact ruins of a farmhouse just 10 kilometers away from Greenland's ice cap, in what was once the western settlement, named Garden under Sandet, or Farm Beneath the Sands. It was discovered by 2 Inuit caribou hunters 80 kilometers east of Nuuk in 1990, when they noticed some weird worked timbers sticking up out of the frozen sand next to a river, which turned out to be from a weaving loom. Kudos to them, they contacted Greenland's museum promptly. And good thing they did, because that river was about to swallow the ruins up. and so to salvage it, it was excavated between 1991 and 1996. Literally thousands of tons of sand had to be removed to get to it, but it was definitely worth it. The farmhouse was inhabited and modified over the entire course of the Western settlement's existence, from the 11th century onwards. The earliest iteration of the site was a 12 by 5 meter house built almost entirely out of turf blocks, like a beginner Minecraft house, with a little stone added in. It was clad in some wooden paneling, with a turf and wattle roof supported by wooden beams and a floor paved with stones. In the center, there was a movable hearth surrounded by benches. The wood was almost entirely driftwood, with characteristic marks left by shipworms, and amazingly, they likely originate from Siberia of all places. And a note about the wood. Greenland doesn't really have any usable trees. I mean, trees do exist there, surprisingly, but they're sort of stunted and low-growing, so the Norse had to rely on driftwood, and potentially trees felled in North America. A 2023 study revealed 8 North American wood samples like hemlock and jack pine in Greenland from as late as the 14th century, based on microscopic anatomical analysis. They were still just mainly used by elites and used in places like the Episcopal Manor at Gardar. Eventually, the house wound up containing up to 30 rooms. There were also animal sheds with stalls and stone paving. Apparently the manure in them was still so thick that it could still be smelled during the excavation, which is crazy. The sheep and cows that used those stalls were probably mainly used for their milk and wool, since the majority of the bones found were from wild animals like hare, seal, and caribou. A perforated polar bear tooth used as a pendant was also found, and I bet the forgotten story of how it got there is pretty wild, eh? Tons of human and sheep lice remains were also discovered, along with well-worn combs used to keep them at bay. Interestingly, fiber thought to be from non-Greenlandic and non-European animals like bison and brown bear were also found. The room with the loom, which happened to be the largest in the house, also contained a niche containing a braid of blonde hair, used as either a bracelet or necklace, which is still apparently a distinctively Scandinavian thing. The house also contained other little treasures like this beautifully decorated early Gothic panel and a little box lid with the name Bjork inscribed into it with runes meant to resemble knots, right next to the sort of dragon's head you'd see on a Viking longship. Other objects bore other runic inscriptions naming other denizens of the house, Thea and Barder. And other interesting artifacts from the Western settlement include remarkably well-preserved wooden Christian sculptures, and of all things, toys, dice, backgammon, and chess pieces, as well as wooden model knives and boats, all testifying to the fact that even here on the very edge of medieval European civilization, people still made time for religion and leisure. But what came of Bjork and Thea and Barder? Well, the Western settlement was abandoned, obviously, but the question is, how? Why? All but one of the house's doors had been left open, and castaway sheep had grazed in its deserted rooms, but the closed one remained closed and had never been entered again, even though later Thule caribou hunters had reused the site as an overnight hunting camp and used its wooden remains to start fires, so eventually it just collapsed. Additionally, no large furnishings were found, suggesting that the abandonment had occurred in an orderly fashion. The why is a bit more complicated. The Western settlement was deserted by about 1350. A Norwegian cleric named Ivar Barderson was sent by the Eastern settlement to check out the Western settlement around the middle 1300s, and at latest around 1361, because no one had heard from them in years. But when he got there, he only found deserted farms and abandoned livestock, which he reports in his work Description of Greenland. Its population only peaked at like 400 people, and for every person living there were 3 people living in the Eastern settlement, so it was always on the edge. But the exact reasons for its demise and the demise of Norse Greenland as a whole remains an open mystery, sort of like the mystery of the Roanoke colony, except way more significant. There have been tons of reasons put forward to explain why exactly the Greenlandic Norse went extinct, and that includes a worsening economy, deteriorating environmental conditions, violent conflict, and more. Truth be told, I think most of them probably came together and all sort of had a hand in creating a real shit show that made the Greenland colony totally untenable. First of all, there's the economic reason, which revolves around the changing value of a single commodity, walrus tusks, because that was Norse Greenland's #1 export, and by changing value, I mean it shrunk. At first, Greenland was Western Europe's only source of ivory, since from the 9th to 13th centuries, it didn't really have much access to the elephant ivory of Africa and Asia, so Greenlandic walrus ivory was used to make some amazing medieval art, like the famous Louis chessmen and various ornate crucifixes. Each high-ranking farmer in Greenland probably had a ship to send north on hunting expeditions, and the walrus skulls they picked up would be shipped whole to various ivory workshops in places like Dublin, Trondheim, and Schleswig, so they could be processed, and from there they were taken all over Europe. But that changed when elephant ivory started flooding into European markets in the 13th century, and it would just go on to become even more common as Portugal started venturing down into sub-Saharan Africa. Interestingly, the switch from walrus to elephant ivory also sort of coincided with the shift from Romanesque to Gothic. Norse Greenland was only economically viable with those tusks because they couldn't keep trading with the rest of the European world for critical supplies of iron and wood and grain and luxuries like wine and other essentials, which were already pretty expensive when the price of their main export was becoming so low. I mean, they even paid their church tithes and taxes in tusks. Every 6 years, they'd pay the Norwegian king his due in the form of walrus tusk shipments. But clearly that stopped cutting it at some point, because in 1282 the Pope Martin IV, ordered that Greenland was to pay its tithes, ostensibly meant for the Crusades, in silver and gold, and to stop sending him walrus tusks. Obviously it's a bit hard to get your hands on gold and silver in Greenland, so years later, in 1327, they were still paying the Pope in walrus. And they didn't really have much else to offer too, since you can only grow hay and fodder in Greenland, and the rest of their exports were just goat skins, ox hides, seal skins, and a type of sturdy rope made from what else but walrus. And to make things even worse, the walrus supply was dwindling, as suggested by a 2020 study that conducted an ADNA and isotopic analysis of a bunch of walrus skulls found in Europe. The latest of these came from a clade of walrus exclusive to Western Greenland and Arctic Canada, known as the Western Mitochondrial Clade of walrus. It seems the Norse eventually exhausted their initial supply around Disco Bay, and would have had to venture further into the Arctic Circle up Baffin Bay to secure dwindling amounts of their ivory. They might have even hunted around Greenland's north coast, and that might be why Norse artifacts wound up in far northern Canada. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the Norse had to resort to using smaller female tusks, and since female tusks were the Inuit people's preference, that might indicate that the Norse were becoming more reliant on trade with the Inuit, or maybe even the very last of the Dorset people. They also probably avoided Greenland's east coast for the most part, since it was choked with ice and walruses are rarely found below Scoresby Sund. That despite arriving during the medieval warm period, the Norse were living in a deteriorating environment in multiple different ways. First off, Greenland was getting drier. Analysis of stuff like leaf wax hydrogen isotopes from lake sediment near a Norse farm 9 kilometers away from Kasiarsuk doesn't show much cooling, but it does show a gradual drying of the environment, which lasted up until the 16th century, which just means grass for livestock became less plentiful. Oddly enough, this actually parallels modern issues in Greenland, because diminishing rainfall in the early 2010s caused a massive reduction in the local hay yield, causing like a 50% reduction of hay and silage. Anyways, it might not be readily apparent from that one lake, but in general there was also a prominent cooling trend, and decreasing summer insolation to boot. More sea ice probably just impeded outside contact, too. If that was the case, it was probably made even worse by how tightly Greenland's Norwegian kings controlled access to the island. By the way, Norse Greenland wasn't really subject to any European kingdoms until the year 1261, or thereabouts, when the Norwegian king Haakon IV the Ancient made it his tributary. Before that, they weren't really a tributary to any European kingdom.
My Arctic desert, my Greenland, my Thule.
The southern Greenlandic ice sheet also began growing again, and you'd think that would play into drying up water and maybe diminishing sea levels, but it actually might have caused catastrophic flooding, because the weight of all that new ice caused crustal subsidence. So a whopping 204 estimated square kilometers of the eastern settlement might have just sunk underwater, since sea levels rose some 3.3 meters, so the Norse would have just lost even more pasturage and probably had to move further inland into the fjords they inhabited, as hundreds of meters of shoreline were just gobbled up. And that sort of plays into the long-standing theory that the Norsemen's stubborn attachment to European customs just prevented them from ever being able to properly adapt to the changing climate by adopting a more Inuit way of life. As evidence for this, people would point to how they refused to ever drop the trendy but drafty sort of European clothing found at the cemetery of Herjolfsnes, which was worn until the very end of the settlement. And that was the dominant theory until pretty recently, but even its former proponents now sort of admit that it was probably mostly wrong. Measures of stable carbon and nitrogen values of human bone collagen sourced from the bones of some 80 Norse individuals from churchyards in both the eastern and western settlements reveal that hunting became just as important as raising livestock, and the sheer number of seal bones found at Norse sites show that the Norsemen consumed increasing amounts of seal, until eventually the products of hunting made up the majority of their diet by the end of the settlement. They also became reliant on seal oil for lighting their homes. And it's not like they just completely exhausted the local environment or anything. They improved local soil quality with manuring, and each family probably had 2 seasonal farms to graze their animals in different places at different times of year. Regardless, they still had to resort to eating gross like ptarmigan feet, and knife marks on the bones of at least one Norse dog show it was butchered. But what about violence? Could that have been why the Norse disappeared? Well, it might be part of the reason. Both Norse documents and Inuit oral history speak of how both populations were intermittently friendly and violently hostile towards each other. From right around the beginning of the colony, the Norse began bumping into the Dorset and the Thule. The late 11th century Historia Norvegiae refers to people who have no iron at all. They use missiles made of walrus tusks and sharp stones for knives. The saga of the people of Floy tells of how Eric the Red's buddy, the splendidly named Thorgils Scarlegs, attempted to visit him in the eastern settlement right around the year 1000, but on his way he got blown way off course and landed in eastern Greenland, where some of his crew took off with his boat right when winter started. It also tells of how he met some local Tornit people. He fought and wounded the first group he encountered, but later let another group borrow his new makeshift boat, which they kindly returned. A few Dorset and Thule objects have been excavated from Norse settlements, like this Thule antler comb from a site called Osmanadal in the western settlement, where a remarkably modern pair of scissors were also found. That's not really relevant, I like the scissors, you know? Also, just as Eric the Red did, they kept on stumbling onto old ruins. Hauk's book, written by Hauker Erlandsson in the early 14th century, describes how northbound expeditions encountered ruins and remains clearly left by the Dorset, or Thule, around Melville Bay, around 1266. And some way or another, both the Dorset and Thule got their hands on Norse stuff, probably mainly through contact in the Disco Bay /Nuuk region. In addition to this fancy spoon case from Sermermiut, cool stuff like chainmail has been found in far northwestern Greenland along Melville Bay, and bronze pots of a type from the late 13th century have been found in Dorset houses, which may have come from Thule intermediaries. Artifacts have also been found in Thule settlements, like chess pieces, shears, etc. And there are an additional 167 pins thought to be derived from the designs of medieval styluses, which are exclusive to Greenland. After the Norse were gone, the Thule also salvaged the bronze from Norse church bells. The exact way they were extracted is unknown, but 33 such church bell fragments are known. And the relationship between the two societies went beyond just encountering one another's ghosts. In 1378, a priest on Iceland recorded in the Icelandic annals that the Skraelings, another word for the Dorset or the Inuit, had raided the Greenlanders and captured 2 boys after killing 18 men. Then a papal brief reported that heathens from neighboring coasts had taken many of Greenland's inhabitants prisoners and destroyed most of its churches, which some have suggested is inaccurate or actually refers to predatory European pirates. But then why are they called heathens? In fact, Eric VII of the Kalmar Union had to repeatedly ask Henry V of Agincourt fame to stop illegal English traffic around his overseas domains. Weirdly, sources from way later in the 16th and 15th centuries also note that small Inuit skin kayaks were hanging up in both Trondheim and Oslo cathedrals. But beyond that, there's no more word of their intercultural relationship from European sources. Inuit oral history, on the other hand, paints a far more vivid picture. The stories in question were collected in the 1850s by a Danish government official named H.J. Rink, and an Inuit artist he knew named Aaron of Kangek made some pretty metal illustrations of them. They'd tell of how, at first, the Inuit and the Norse got along just fine. There's one somewhat odd story where an Inuit boy and a Norse boy got along, but then the Norse boy challenged the Inuit boy to an archery competition on the top of a mountain where they would both try to hit a target in the sea, and whoever lost would be pushed off the mountain. The Norse boy lost and then insisted that he be pushed off the mountain, and the Inuit boy was obviously aghast and said, "I'd rather not do that," but because it was the Norse boy's idea, the Norse men watching him also insisted that he be pushed off. So he was, and apparently that episode didn't damage Norse-Inuit relationships. But that supposedly all changed when Inuit girls started working on Norse farms, and that's because hostilities first began when one of them, named Navaranach, lied to each group saying they were both preparing to attack one another, leading to a Norse preemptive strike that wound up turning into a massacre. Some of the fatalities included the wife and only infant child of a man named Kasapi, who then pursued the Norse in a boat camouflaged like a dirty iceberg. Sounds a little familiar. In turn, Kasapi and his posse killed everyone in the house of the Norse chief Ungortok, which might be a version of the name Ingvarder. The chief and his own infant son jumped out of a window to escape. He turned out to just be too fast to be apprehended, but only after kissing his son goodbye and then throwing him into a frozen lake. Another variant claims Ungortok killed Kasapi's brother, so Kasapi cut off Ungortok's own arm and said, "As long as I live, and as long as you live, your arm will not be forgotten," whatever that means. That story might actually explain the end of the Western settlement, but the relationship with the Eastern settlement might have stayed all right. Navaranach was punished for creating the conflict by being dragged until her back wore away. The legend goes that her executioners repeatedly asked her, "Are you happy now?" which she always replied to with, "You better believe I'm happy." Niels Egede, son of the guy who brought Protestantism to Greenland, Hans Egede, also reported that he was told that the Inuit helped the Norse of the Eastern settlement out against other Europeans, oddly enough. These stories aren't 100% reliable, though, and it's possible that they're just inventions meant to shift the blame for wiping the Norse colony out from the Inuit of the missionary period to their ancestors, since the Danish missionaries they interacted with, like Hans Egede, were under the impression that was the case. In fact, Hans initially thought that the Greenlandic Norse were still alive, but had abandoned Christianity, which is why he felt compelled to go there in the first place. Also, one last thing, skeletons of Norse women tend to be younger than skeletons of Norse men, so young women of childbearing age had a lower lifespan than men, so there was a skew towards us guys in the sex ratio, and as a result, less children were being born, so that probably didn't help how Greenland's already very small population kept steadily decreasing. I mean, the Eastern settlement's population probably only peaked at just 1,700 people around 1380, and in total, the whole of North Greenland only ever had a peak population of like 2,500 max, and that skew in the sex ratio was happening as Greenland was getting more impoverished because their ivory was losing its value and environmental conditions were just screwing with them. So, as I said earlier, it became a show. The last recorded event in Norse Greenland was the wedding of Sigrid Bjornsdottir and Thorstein Olafsson, which was held in September of 1408 in Hvalsey Church, and that was mentioned in later Icelandic letters. The source of those letters are the couple themselves, who moved to Iceland later, and they're from when they had to prove they were legally married in the 1420s. Oh, also, just a year earlier than the wedding in 1407, the second last recorded event in North Greenland was when a guy who supposedly seduced another man's wife with black magic was burnt at the stake at the same place, Hvalsey. The last recorded trade expedition from Iceland to Greenland occurred in 1410, and after that, poof, the Greenlandic Norse just disappear from history. Well, maybe not quite. In 1530, the Bishop of Skalholt in Iceland, a guy named Amund, may have spotted Norsemen driving their cattle after getting precariously close to the shore of Herjolfsnes. In 1625, an Icelandic author named Bjorn Johnson wrote that within living memory, maybe around 1540, an Icelandic or maybe German guy on a German merchant vessel, ironically called John Greenlander, was blown off course to Greenland and encountered the frozen corpse of a lone Norseman lying face down on the ground of an uninhabited island. The island contained boathouses and some stone walls, but was otherwise empty. The dead man was dressed in homespun wool, sealskin, and a hood. His knife was found nearby, and apparently it was bent and much worn and eaten away, because its precious iron was ground over and over again to the extreme to make the most of it. The knife was taken back to Iceland as a keepsake, and thus the last of the Greenlandic Norse disappeared. The absence of valuable portable items at Norse archaeological sites might suggest that the last Norse inhabitants just returned or tried to return to Europe or Iceland and didn't actually all die out, but then again, no mass exodus is recorded in Icelandic records, though that may be because it was a more gradual abandonment. But for the next few centuries, people still believed that some Norsemen still lived in Greenland, and a bunch of expeditions meant to regain contact with them were talked about and in some cases sent out, but obviously to no avail. A lot of them were sent out by Danish monarchs because at that point the ownership of Greenland had transferred from the Norwegian kings to the Danish kings as a consequence of the Scandinavian kingdoms unifying and falling apart and unifying and falling apart, whatever. This isn't Scandinavian History 101, okay? And anyways, it's time to turn back to the non-Norse inhabitants of Greenland because, as I alluded to earlier, yet another Greenlandic people mysteriously disappeared. And I'm of course talking about the Dorset, who completely vanished around the same time as the Norse between 1300 and 1500. The same genetic study I mentioned earlier also confirms that the Dorset were essentially completely replaced by Greenland's modern majority ethnic group, the Thule Inuit, and that there's genetic discontinuity between the two populations. But it also indicated that there is sorta some gene flow between them, but it dates back 4,000 years and likely happened back in Siberia. So the modern Thule largely aren't the direct descendants of the Dorset. However, another study of 227 randomly selected Greenlandic males showed that they have two paternal Y chromosomal lineages within the wider Y chromosome haplogroup QM242, which is pretty common among Native Americans. The M3 locus is probably completely Thule, but the NWT01 locus could potentially be derived from the Paleo-Eskimo. After all, the Thule and Dorset did coexist in Greenland for anywhere between 50 and 200 years, but the connection isn't set in stone, and it could also very well be Thule. There's also a conception that East Greenlanders are a distinctive synthesis of Dorset, Norse, and Thule, and it's been said that to an extent the Dorset style still sort of exists in East Greenlandic art, which is pretty distinctive. This might tie into the theory that some Norse stragglers just assimilated into Inuit culture, and regardless, modern Greenlanders are generally 40 to 45% European, and many have typically European Y chromosomes, including R1A and R1B. But the vast majority of their maternal lineages, the mitochondrial DNA, is purely Inuit, so the modern Greenlanders are largely a synthesis of Scandinavian men and Thule Inuit women, but that's probably all from the modern Danish presence. So regardless, the Dorset or the Tunit were replaced. The Inuit do credit them with the creation of crucial fish weirs and boulder cairns which guide caribous to ambush sites along river crossings. The Dorset also may have given the Thule seal hole hunting techniques and a type of stone fox trap entered from the top. Inuit legends also say that they were large, possibly even giant people with innate strength, but ultimately they were also very timid and couldn't withstand the rapid and unrelenting spread of the Thule Inuit. So let's explore the archaeological treasures the Thule left behind in Greenland, but let me just give you a little more info on their background first. Research into the origins of the early Thule culture on Ellesmere Island in the 1980s revealed that they appeared there only between 1200 and 1400 after coming there from Alaska and ultimately Siberia, since they likely descend from the Siberian Burnirk culture of the 6th to 7th centuries AD. Between the years 1200 and 1300, the Dorset and Thule coexisted in the Smith Sound. But around that point, the Dorset disappeared and the Thule reached eastern Greenland's Scoresby Sund. By 1500, they had spread almost everywhere across Greenland, but the Little Ice Age eventually rendered living in the north and northeast impossible, though not before they left behind this huge, pristinely preserved paddle boat, or umiak, held together with big spikes of walrus ivory and a little bit of iron, which was discovered by Egil Knuth at a place called Herlusholm Strand in good old Perryland between 1948 and 49. As far as I can tell, it's now in the Danish National Museum. The Thule introduced dog sleds to Greenland, since the Dorset only had hand-pulled sleds, which must have been pretty miserable, and they also introduced the umiak, which allowed them to target baleen whales that Dorset could never reach. They also introduced a new distinctive type of dwelling with long, narrow passageways meant to keep out the cold, and raised rear sleeping platforms. And sometimes they actually used whale bones to make the rafters of their homes, which looked pretty cool. The best-known archaeological remains the Thule left behind are their mummies. The most famous of them are from a place called Kilakitsoq, which is a name I've been repeating to myself in my head over and over again as I've been making this because it's so weirdly catchy. Say it to yourself, Kilakitsoq, Kilakitsoq. It's weird. Or maybe I'm overthinking it. Kilakitsoq is near the modern town of Umanak on the Nuussuaq Peninsula, just north of Disco Bay. It was clearly a pretty sacred place because human remains covered by piles of stone still litter the landscape. In 1972, two brothers hunting grouse stumbled upon far better preserved individuals piled into two stacks and sheltered by a rock ledge, which kept snow and rain off them while also allowing them to be ventilated by the dry Arctic wind. Eventually, they were excavated in 1978. One grave contained two poor young boys and 3 women, and the other contained 3 more women. The best preserved of them, a 6-month-old boy, and 3 of the women are now on permanent display in Greenland's National Museum in the nearby capital city, Nuuk. Even just beyond their incredibly well-preserved clothing, these mummies offer a pretty good window into Thule customs and the hardships they had to endure. One of the mummy's most striking features are the near-identical tattoos on the faces of the 5 oldest women, which probably show that they belong to the same tribe or kinship group, which has been confirmed with modern DNA analysis, showing that they belong to 3 connected maternal lineages that were buried at Kilakitsoq at about the same time, around 1475 or so. So, as one author put it, these tattoos probably served as a visual language with a protective function, but getting them must have been pretty agonizing because some of them were made by pulling a needle with a sinew which had been dipped in soot under the skin, which sounds pretty painful, but obviously it's lasted for quite a while. The 2 little boys tell a sadder story. One of them is a little 2-year-old who probably had Down syndrome or Calvé-Perthes disease. One of the 2 boys, I'm not sure which, was also infected with nematodes, probably from eating raw walrus meat, and all of the mummies had lungs filled with soot inhaled from the seal oil lamps they relied on for light and warmth. They were also all infested with lice when alive. In fact, some got into their digestive system, probably because the lice was so abundant that it somehow wound up in their food. And this poor 6-month-old baby boy, whose face is eerily reminiscent of a porcelain doll, might have been buried alive. The Thule sometimes buried infant children alive with their mothers if they happened to pass and no one was left to take care of them, especially if they were unable to digest hard foods. It obviously sounds pretty cruel, but you have to understand that these Thule lived incredibly precarious lives. Best exemplified by this quote from an Inuit man named Samuk, told to Knud Rasmussen in 1931. "There is not one among us who has not experienced a winter of bad hunting, when many people starve to death around us, and when we ourselves only pulled through by accident. But then how should one who is well and has eaten his fill be able to understand the madness of hunger? We only know that we all want so much to live." And unfortunately, there are even more Thule mummies that are a result of this practice. A number of other mummies come from caves in Pisesarvik in Nuuk Fjord. By the way, Pisesarvik is where that Norse boy got pushed off that mountain. These other mummies were also more or less dried out by the Arctic wind, and in 1950 1852, some 6 women and children dating from between the 18th and 15th centuries were discovered and taken to Denmark's National Museum by Jorgen Meldgaard. There are some infants among them whose limbs and necks are bent in a certain way that suggests they had experienced muscle contractions associated with death by dehydration or strangulation. This may have been a result of famine or illness. Anyways, the Thule culture proper ended with the return of the Scandinavians, which is usually considered to have started with Hans Egil's arrival in 1721. But what does all this mean for Greenland's future? Well, a lot, I think. It seems like there's a growing independence movement in Greenland, which is completely understandable. As we've seen, the various people of Greenland have always acted pretty independently, for better or worse. But what really worries me is that it seems to be coming in the form of open hostility towards the Danish, and unfortunately, to some extent, the memory of Norse Greenland. Maybe I'm reading the situation wrong, but I've seen videos of Greenlanders saying stuff like, "We hate the Danish."
No more Danish. No more Danish. We don't like Danish people.
And the Prime Minister of Greenland emphatically said, "We're not Danes," and that he'll decide Greenland's future with the US, while the Danish PM just weakly smiled at him, which is incredibly ironic because, like most Greenlanders, he clearly has Scandinavian roots. He shares the same last name as Hans Egil, after all. The popular Greenlandic YouTuber Q's Greenland, who I generally find quite charming, has incorrectly said that the Norse weren't in Greenland before the Inuit, which is just a lie. As we've seen, the Norse first arrived in Greenland in the late 10th century, and the Thule Inuit arrived centuries later, and in doing so, they replaced the Arctic's original inhabitants, the Paleo-Eskimo, in their latest form as the Dorset. As I mentioned, it's possible that there is a limited genetic connection between some Inuit and the Dorset, since they sort of coexisted for 50 to 200 years, but that remains murky. Obviously, the Inuit deserve to be in Greenland. It's been their home for 700 years, but technically, and as weird as it sounds, Scandinavians are the indigenous minority of Greenland. People who identify as just Scandinavians still make up 10% of the population, after all. It's true that the Greenlandic Norse did go extinct sometime in the 15th or 16th centuries, and Scandinavians did have to abandon Greenland because of deteriorating conditions, but as we've seen, that same trend happened time and time again throughout Greenland's history. The Paleo-Eskimo had to abandon parts of Greenland multiple times, which is why Eric the Red encountered nothing but their ruins, and the Thule Inuit themselves were forced to abandon parts of northern Greenland when the climate there worsened. So that really isn't an argument against their indigeneity. Greenland's independence movement is framed as an anti-colonial struggle, but I mean, how is Denmark's 18th century reclamation of Greenland not justified? The Scandinavians were there first, and the hostility towards them is just plain wrong. No one should be discriminated against in their home. If a future independent Greenland, or a Greenland stolen from Denmark by the US under the pretense of gaining self-determination, operates under the assumption that Scandinavians and their culture don't deserve to exist there compared to Inuit culture, then that would be a betrayal of Scandinavians everywhere, and a complete middle finger to the legacy of the Greenlandic Norse, whose ancient bones still lie under Greenlandic soil. I mean, the Danish gave the world Legos, and we're just gonna backstab them like this? Come on. Anyways, there's one last set of ruins I want to talk about, because recently the US President, DJT, has been quoted as saying that he wants re-ownership of Greenland, which is obviously a pretty sketchy thing to say, but there are actually American military ruins in Greenland, and unfortunately they don't put the US involvement there in the best of lights. The US did actually occupy Greenland during World War II, officially starting on April 9th, 1941, with an agreement between the US Secretary of State Cordell Hull and the Danish ambassador to the US, Henrik Kaufmann, with the permission of Greenlandic leaders. This made Greenland a part of a huge US neutrality zone and essentially made it a US protectorate. Canada was also interested in protecting Greenland, but the Greenlanders didn't want that because it would mean joining the war, which of course backfired when the US joined the war later that year. Both countries wanted Greenland to secure control over a cryolite mine at Ivigtut, which was of critical importance at the time, because apparently that cryolite thing, which is a rare earth mineral, is a critical component of the sort of aluminum needed to build aluminum-skinned aircraft. So you know, the stuff you see in War Thunder. Canada was actually getting ready to seize it for itself, since we were building a ton of planes for the British, and ourselves of course, but after kindly informing America of the plan, a meeting in Warm Springs, Georgia in late April of 1941 between FDR and Mackenzie King, FDR convinced him not to go for it. But at one point in the war, we apparently garrisoned it with 480 men, so there's something. Also, technically, if Denmark ever gives Greenland up, Britain, or by extension maybe Canada, would be the only country legally able to buy it. In 1917, Denmark did actually sell territory to the US, what now makes up the US Virgin Islands, and after a failed attempt to include Greenland in the deal, Woodrow Wilson was forced to sign a letter acknowledging that Greenland is and will forever be Danish, at least according to the last Danish minister for Greenland, Tom Høyen. What is absolutely certain and definitely in writing on the official State Department website is the statement, "The government of the United States of America will not object to the Danish government extending their political and economic interests to the whole of Greenland," which was written by Secretary of State Robert Lansing on August 4th, 1916. So yeah, there's that. I don't know if that means anything legally, but it's there. Oh, and as part of all that, Britain negotiated the right to get first dibs on Greenland if it's ever put up for sale on Canada's behalf. Anyways, Greenland's strategic value also came from the fact that it's a great place to monitor storms approaching Western Europe, which has all sorts of important military implications. The Germans certainly thought so, since they went out of their way to create 4 weather bases there. That includes a large one named Holzog in Hansa Bay on Sabine Island in northeastern Greenland, which operated until 1943, and one named Edelweiss 2, which lasted until 1944. Interestingly, there are actually some remaining archaeological traces of these, and as I was alluding to earlier, there are also a bunch of abandoned World War II air bases there from America's wartime occupation of Greenland, including one called Bluey East 2, abandoned in late 1947, whose rusting remains scar the landscape of a remote fjord in eastern Greenland. That includes thousands of empty fuel drums whose contents have since leaked away, and asbestos-laced building materials to boot. Denmark is set to spend $30 million cleaning it and other abandoned US military bases up, so I guess ironically, Denmark is subsidizing the US now. There are also these ruins buried 100 feet beneath Greenland's ice cap, which were just discovered by NASA in April of 2024 with aerial radar instruments. They're from Camp Century, a relic of the Cold War that consisted of tunnels painstakingly cut into the surface of the ice sheet back in 1959. It was intended to host 600 ballistic missiles aimed straight at Moscow, and it is genuinely impressive as an engineering accomplishment, but it had to be abandoned in the late 60s, and ever since, the ice has continued to accumulate over it, eventually swallowing it whole. And what's worse, it was powered by a portable nuclear reactor, which produced a lot of radioactive waste. Like, a lot. Like 1.2 billion becquerels of the stuff. So let's hope that radiation doesn't ever leak out of there, which is what the US Army certainly hoped for when it just abandoned all that waste there. There's also 24 million liters of biological waste, 200,000 liters of diesel fuel, and not to mention thousands of tons of rotting infrastructure. So it would be a great location in Fallout. Oh my gosh, it'd be awesome. But the problem is, it's possible that all that waste could filter into aquifers deeper within the ice that might reach the sea. And it's possible that's already begun, actually. Ironically, it's thought to pose a major threat to future American development in Greenland. But as we've seen, Greenland isn't just a place for extracting oil and minerals. It's a unique place with thousands of years of distinct history. For thousands of years, it's served as a home to the 3 distinct peoples that have been hardy enough to colonize it. And despite how ruthlessly harsh it is, it's still stunningly beautiful. And you know what else is stunningly beautiful? My silver play button. There it is, baby. Look at that beauty. Wow. So shiny. Whoa. It's the silver play button.
Crazy.
Dang. So soft. Thank you guys so much for this. It really, truly means a lot to me. And I never would have gotten this had it not been for viewers just like you. And especially those that support my Patreon. So as we do every video, let's go through all their names. There's Dhruv Singhal at the very top, Booga 420, Bajun, Harrison Timperley, Doc Bossman, Kevin Ryan, Ayanami Amamami, Bomb Tombadil, Danny Banani, Rose Klein, James Kirk, Alyssa P., Mark Elliott Cullen, Shemek Wierzbicki, Jack Lester, Mithridates, Jake the Snake, Liv Buller, Tyler Doucette, Inbred Cat, Have a Cigar, Alex Clark, Jess Sullivan, Akyune, Mark Krupnik, Miha Needog, Michael, Daisies for Ghosts, Kalen P., Julie Lau, Zafiro, Bean Burrito, The Spoofer, Emily Cujo, Stevan, Griffin Frost, and our newest patrons, Hippolyta, nice classical reference there, Magne de Broiker, very nice, refined, aristocratic name there, Julia Erickson, who's rejoined, and JP Van Splendor, with maybe the best name of all. Alright, thank you guys so much for watching. If this video does really well, I might make a video on the hidden archaeology of North Korea, but only if this video does well, so let's see. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, goodbye.